Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 6th of February, and today's video is important because we're looking at two concurrent offensives, one coming from each side. First of all, the Russians advancing further west of the Oskil River and capturing another village, and really it has been one of their largest gains up to date during this entire Oskil River offensive that started over the past month or so. Then on the Ukrainian side, you have a localized counterattack that was launched in the early morning of February 6th, being today, just south of Suja near the Psel River. We're going to cover both of those events, but I do want to begin by looking at Andriivka. So as we do so, please like and subscribe so I can grow the channel. Now, over here, you can see, according to Ukrainian sources, the Russian side has been able to capture another zero point 0.7 square kilometers. And this is within the town itself. It's not even on the outskirts anymore. At this point, you have the Russian side firmly ingrained within the center of the settlement. And there just is not a lot of depth for Andriivka and its totality. You can see the Russians advancing a total of 1.7 kilometers westwards, meaning they only have to capture another 2.5 kilometers along this horizontal axis in order to get control over the rest of the houses over here. And you can see that the houses are private residential areas with a lot of gardens. They're more dispersed, and they're actually far less dense than in Dakhni, for instance, which is smaller in terms of surface area. But on the other hand, it is far more concentrated and therefore difficult to pass through. And that is in contrast to what we see over here with Andriivka, wherein the Russian forces were able to find a really, really exposed Ukrainian portion of the front line. They were able to tap into it and continue with that momentum. The Ukrainians have since been unable to stop them, and you're seeing the Russians continue to advance in large part on foot along this particular highway. And now they're making that sort of detour, moving rightwards and into the center of the town, fighting in the local school region, in a couple of areas of significance. But again, the structures themselves aren't that large over there. There probably are basements, but again, nothing that's more than one or two stories. There may be a couple of duplexes. The Ukrainian forces over here, they are focused on so many locations. For instance, east of Zelnivka, 37th Marine Brigade is over there. Dakhnia, currently very important clashes. We're going to zoom in on in a second. So it's absolutely imperative that they retain control over that settlement. At the same time, there's also all of the fighting unfolding around Srebny. And so, just understandably, the Ukrainians don't have all of their commitments towards defending in this one particular area in Andriivka. But the loss of Andriivka will then lead to additional collapses of other Ukrainian defensive positions and other villages that are adjacent to it, like Konstantinopil and Ulakli. And therefore, all of the other positions to the east in this really ingrained, entrenched sort of pocket that is sort of disconnected from the rest of the Ukrainian rear, it's also going to come under a lot of danger from the flanks. And that's a part of why Andriivka has to be held on to. But right now, the Russian pace and the lack of depth that the Ukrainians have over here, in addition to the lack of proper reinforcements, we did talk about some of them coming in recently, like 152, but that is nowhere near enough given the current Russian pace of advances. So if this tide is not turned in an immediate manner right now, then the Russians will be able to further expand and take over the remaining houses over here, and then take advantage of the vast array of road networks that are connected to Andriivka to advance southwards and then move westwards towards the next inevitable targets, which would be Kamar in the next sort of longer period of time. But when we're talking about long, we're not necessarily talking about anything that is too far in the future. We're just saying that first, the situation in Andriivka has to be dealt with from a Russian perspective. Now, when it comes to Dakhnia, you can see over here the 46th Brigade is no longer the main unit operating. It is actually 33rd Brigade. 46th is operating in Andriivka. So they also have continued to resist within the center of the town, but to the north, the Russian forces have been able to achieve another advance today. This is a video from the 68th Army Corps. They raised their flag in Western Dakhnia in a local school, and this comes as there were also advances in the southern parts of the town, only leaving this sort of enclave, which is connected to the warehouses and then by extension to the anti-tank ditches, open fields, and tree lines that are just all to the east of Andriivka suburbs. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward as we continue to see development on that part of the front line. but I really do want to focus most of my attention today on the situation in the Oskil River and Kursk regions. So over here, you can see the Russian advance amounting to almost 9 square kilometers of territory. So that is a non-trivial amount. It actually is a lot, and it does rival some of the other large-scale gains accrued by the Russian forces over the past couple of weeks over here. Like this one's also 8.87 square kilometers in size. So they are pretty similar size advances by the Russian side continued, but just time a bit to the north. So just the logic behind the Russians advancing over here would be that they have been able to secure control over most of the Varichna, except for, say, the Pidvarki district a bit to the north over here. But they were able to take Debriivka and as a result gain access to this paved road that extends northwards. And as a result, they've been able to capture a really undefended location because not only is it a hamlet, but it's also just this large open region where you lack Ukrainian sizable reinforcements to contain the Russian advance. And as a result, on February 6th, the 112th National, or not National, but Territorial Defense Brigade, they conducted FPV strikes onto those individual Russian soldiers advancing through the houses over here, indicating that the brigade is operating over here and is trying to contain the Russian gains on this northern flank, but don't have the wherewithal on the ground to actually push back with a localized counterattack. So the drone crews are the ones that are actually trying to subdue those individual Russian soldiers. But it is a good way to point to the fact that now the Russians have been able to advance at a maximum 6.5 kilometers northwards in this location. In the process, also securing all of this riverboard located to the west of the Oskil, and this includes a lot of dense forested patches, largely on valleys. Also, probably means that Novoblinsk is under full Russian control, but I'm just waiting for a geolocation before I make that definitive change and announce it. But as you guys can see, based on elevation, the Russians actually advanced through a lower lying region, but it is understandable that they would because of the road network and the connection to populated regions. So this is on a lower elevated axis, but then over here a bit to the east, you have the local ridge, followed by the river valley located on low elevation as well. And then to the west, this is an area where you do have some significant ridges, some significant high ground that the Russians are looking to expand their control towards, because right now Ukraine contains or retains, I should say, control over a lot of these areas. So you can see them marked with this red perimeter. A bit further to the west, that's where you have another one of those sort of valleys, and it does sort of make sense because it is a region that is just connected to a couple of other villages and ponds. But when it comes to elevation, with the Russians advancing along a valley and along a key road, they can then turn their attention either to the west or to the east in order to gain control over favorable positions on ridges that overlook the rest of the Ukrainian rear. And I would imagine that if the Russians do have success in this location, they would try to eventually connect it with the current bridgehead that is being formed in the Topolda region and more generally with the border between Russia and Ukraine. And that would sort of be in addition to the current operations going on a bit to the south that are aimed at attacking towards the western side of Kupiansk. So there are some diverging objectives. But as we move to the northwest, I do want to look at the situation in Kursk because really I feel bad about this, but I've not really covered it that much because there weren't that many movements over the past couple of weeks. The Ukrainians have been steadfast in their defense of the pocket. I refer to it as the Malaya Luknaya pockets. They've been able to, despite total lack of depth and the really, really compromised logistics, have been able to hold on to positions in this outstretched pocket for an extended period of time because they understand that it is one of the best insurance policies that prevents the Russians from advancing southwards directly towards Suja, which is the crown jewel of the current Ukrainian sort of operation launched in August into Kursk. And another reason why they're really conducting this sort of proactive approach is in order to set the battlefield in a way where the Russians can never get too close to Suja. And that's something that the Russians did in this case. Over the past couple of months, the Russians have been gradually able to advance from areas like Borky and then to Plekhovo, and then eventually reach the Psel River itself, which you can see marked on the map over here. And then in numerous cases, they were able to cross over and already begin to pass through dense forested regions into populated areas that are really, really close to Suja. We're talking about like less than 3 kilometers away. And this culminated with really fierce clashes in the village of Makhanovka, with back and forth fighting. Initially, the Russians being able to infiltrate deep into the village, but then elements of Brigade 116 were able to push them back. But then in recent times, we're talking about late January, you did have once again a Russian attempt to re enter into houses, and they definitely are located in a nearby warehouse. And it was targeted by the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, even though that brigade is not really one that is prominent on this part of the front line. It's more so located to the north near the Kruglik region. It was involved in the earlier offensive. I think that was like, yeah, the beginning of January. That's when the offensive occurred. And it very quickly died down, as I mentioned and projected. And probably there was universal agreement on that. So it's nothing special. But those gains were very quickly reversed, and really the amount of losses that the Ukrainians took, which weren't that high in absolute terms, but in relative terms, when you're looking at the sort of valuable equipment and the way in which it could have been applied, and also the ways in which it did or did not help the overall Ukrainian objective in this region, it did turn out to be very underwhelming. And again, we're looking at sort of the reasoning. I suppose the reasoning for the Ukrainians launching an attack over there would be to create this sort of larger buffer from the northeastern flank with the R200 road that would push into Suja. But in the end, it didn't do anything of the sorts. It just sort of kept the situation where it was, or even made it worse in some cases. Now, an area where counterattacks are even more desperately needed would be south of Suja directly. And this is actually an area where I could understand why the Ukrainians would try to muster forces and conduct those sort of counterattacks, because there are always logical reasons for why there may be a rationale behind actually going on the offensive and not digging in. So there have been numerous cases, for instance, around Pokrovsk, where the Russians were able to take a forward outpost like a mine shaft or some sort of house in a village or trench that was very important to the Ukrainian side. And there's nothing wrong in principle with taking it back if it leads to long-term stability and is able to use to then be used to project firepower towards the Russian side. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, as long as it can be executed correctly without taking disproportionate losses. Now, over here, what happened is, according to Russian sources, they were able to monitor at least 10 vehicles being moved from the Sumy region into the Suja area. So the Russians already had a reconnaissance on this movement from the beginning of the day, probably even from last night. And again, we're not looking at that large of a maneuver, but even still, they were able to notice that there was an uptick in transfers of equipment. Now, this also occurred at a time when there were pretty bad weather conditions, all foggy and precipitation. And so it was difficult for UAVs to get a full understanding of what was occurring. And even once the attacks started, it was difficult for Russian drone crews to fully maximize their sort of efficiency and damage caused to the other side because of those weather issues. That's also a part of why the Ukrainians launched it during this time of year. And all in all, there are some conflicting reports, but at a maximum, it was mentioned that 3 Ukrainian battalions were involved in the attack. I would say it's probably even smaller based on the footage that I've seen because of how concentrated it is in its size. Some sources have claimed that there were 350 Ukrainian soldiers involved in total, along with 50 armored vehicles and tanks, which does seem like a pretty realistic number. I've seen some that are even lower, saying like 30 armored vehicles or tanks, and similar numbers in terms of the force composition. I can't see it being much larger than that in earnest. When it comes to the units that were involved in the attack, it could probably be from the 61st Mechanized Brigade, but there is also a lot of specialized Western equipment that may be from the air assault forces. So we don't know for sure. It could also be an effort that involved 144th Mechanized Brigade, which was recently deployed to this location from the Velika Novosilka region, and the 129th Kryvyi Territorial Defense Brigade is also operating around here, and they're doing so in tandem with the Black Raven drone group. They actually recorded this compilation on, what was this, February 4th. That's when it was released, and it was a monthly summary of their activities in this part of the front line protecting southern Suja. And in the geolocation, it actually proved that the Russians were able to advance 1.8 square kilometers of additional territory on the eastern bank of the Psal River. It included, I believe, the killing of 17 Russian soldiers and wounding 31 in the claims made by the drone group. So they claim that in 1 month they were able to kill that amount of Russian soldiers and wound 31 of them, along with destroying 22 small boats, because you do have this incessant Russian attempt or movement across and then back to the other side of the Sel River, trying to gain footholds on the other side. And so a lot of those become sitting ducks and obvious targets for the Ukrainian drone operators in this location. When it comes to the actual offensive, though, you can see over here the Ukrainians were able to advance 4.8 square kilometers. The main axis was along this road over here, this road that extends from the eastern parts of Suja, really reaching the industrial area, and then advancing southwards, taking over the local gas station. You could see that on the map, and then also reaching the eastern outskirts of Cherkasskaya Konopelka. Finally, actually taking over Fanasivka, which is a pretty small hamlet, but when it comes to the full extent of the Ukrainian advances, it amounts to around 3.6 kilometers in that southern direction. Sometimes the footage shows varying amounts of vehicles involved in a singular attack. One such video showed 9 vehicles in the same column advancing southwards. And if there were 50, then you would imagine that there would be several times over that amount of columns seen throughout the day that the Russians had to deal with. Over here on February 6th, you had 9 armored vehicles filmed as they were advancing southwards from Kolmakov. One of them was already destroyed and seen burning in the video. As they reached further south and reached near Cherkasska and Konopelka, there probably were attempts at detouring and dismounting forces in this village to try to take it over. That is certainly possible given the proximity, but I just don't have any confirmation yet. So I'm leaving it in a gray zone. Here you can see this is a Vandal FPV strike. Those are fiber optic FPVs. So they struck a Ukrainian Cougar MRAP. This is from February 6th. Then a bit to the south, you see similar sort of damage incurred by the Ukrainian side. Here, another Ukrainian MRAP was struck east of Konopelka, and then to the south over here, 177th Marine Regiment. They conducted FPV strikes, targeted an armored vehicle, and at the same time, Battalion 382nd of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade. They used fiber optic FPVs to strike 5 armored vehicles. Among them, there were, I believe, a few on MRAPs and the French VABs. This is in addition to a lot of other fiber optic footage, and it's mainly fiber optics. But even in some cases, regular FPV drones were used, and there was just a noted lack of Ukrainian jamming equipment. And even if there wasn't, it would not be that effective against these fiber optics, even looking deeper and using the range of 15, 20 kilometers. That also presented some significant issues for the Ukrainians as they were accumulating on the rear. But even once they made it in, it became even more dangerous. And a lot of Ukrainian vehicles were damaged within this same sort of like 3 to 4 kilometer from north to south spanning corridor. Pretty much one road they were all targeted on. And it also included an M113 APC, a Berg Panzer II armored recovery vehicle. There were some demining vehicles as well, in addition to a Striker APC that was targeted along with 2 tanks. So the list goes on and on. Some Russian sources claim that the amount of damage or losses for the Ukrainian side in terms of vehicles amounts to 20 already. And in a lot of cases, we look at the sort of armored assaults launched by the Russians. We've covered them numerous times in areas like the Novomikhailivka battles from last year. But in this case, it is sort of a sort of exceptional event because the Ukrainians don't usually launch these sort of bulky attacks with armored vehicles, especially ones using the Western sort of equipment, because there is obviously a finitude to it that really has to be kept at a fine line. And whenever it does get crossed that line, it does lead to a lot of conversation, obviously. And based on confirmed footage of strikes, we've probably seen at least 15 vehicles struck. So we're looking at soon, with official and unofficial sources, almost half of the armored vehicles getting lost. Could maybe not destroyed, but they definitely got hit by FPVs, and it could be reach even higher in the coming days if the Ukrainians are now going to double down on their efforts over here, because there are reports from the Russian side that the Ukrainians are looking to renew their attacks and expand even further southwards, because they were able to advance along this road over here to Fanasivka, as we talked about, take over these houses, but they were not able to take Ulanok, which was probably one of the really important targets because it's the largest settlement nearby that is north of the Psal River. And getting control over that along with the northern bank of the river would then cut off the remaining Russian positions that are located on this western portion that is north of the riverbank, and also generally a lot of the fields and forested patches that are located in this sort of western pocket, protecting the northern flank of Plechovo. And more generally, the ring and I would say horizontal line of villages that is located in this region that is used by that are currently used by the Russians as a conduit between the rear, where you have Giri, and then the front line where you have the attacks pushing towards Murni and Suja. So that's a part of the logic, I would assume. All this region is located on low elevation, so there's not one side that gets an advantage from ridges one way or another in the immediacy of the front line over here that you can see on my map. But there are a couple of heights that are located a bit to the west, for instance, on the Ukrainian side or on the Russian side over here. But the actual current clashes are all going on within really low elevated valleys. But when it comes to the Russian side, just mentioning some of the key units involved in the clashes, you have the 78th Rakhmat Motorized Rifle Regiment. You also have two, I think, yeah, you had an Akhmat drone company that was deployed over here that has two distinct drone crews that are currently operating on the front line and targeting the Ukrainian armored vehicles. So they're also operating around here along with the 30th Motorized Rifle Regiment and 177th Naval Infantry Regiment, which was previously operating around the Kuryomivka or Southern Bakhmut front line, whatever you want to refer to it as. There are a couple of other units over here, like Battalion 382 of 110th Naval Infantry Brigade and 11th VDV Brigade is operating around here. So also 204th Akhmat Regiment, another element that is operating in this location. So that's a general overview of the order of battle based on Russian sources like Romanov and from just publicly available footage. The 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, they had their logo on one of the videos showing the stored Ukrainian equipment, but it appears that they just edited the video for the 177th Regiment, but they are not actually located over here. They're still in Velika and Vasilka. And so that's all for today. We'll see if the Ukrainians try to renew their attack along the same axis, if they try to push a bit to the east and get some sort of insurance through pushing into Ruskaya Konopelka, or if they try to renew attacks towards Krylovka and push the Russians across the Sel River in its entirety, or if these attacks just simmer out, die down, and we don't really discuss it going forward. Regardless, I'm going to keep you guys updated. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.